Can we get going now, because we've got an hour and I think we've got quite a lot to talk about. I'm Robin Nicholson. I'm senior partner of Edward Cullinan Architects, and I was chair of the jury for this competition, which was a really well organised competition, I have to say. Tiny, only 3 houses, but it generated a huge amount of interest. There's an awful lot going on in low energy housing design, whether it's new or retrofit, but I think wherever you are, the feedback is really bad, and all the lessons get lost in the process. So we thought it would be really good to have this session to try and capture some of the lessons. So to help us, Sarah Allan will start, and she organised the whole competition, obviously with some help from other people, but she's the main driver and she'll explain the context. And then Richard Partington will tease out some of the lessons. You could say it's a bit odd not asking Robert Sackler to present his scheme. This is more of a discussion about the lessons learnt from all the schemes. And there'll be plenty of opportunity to talk with Robert and the rest of his team upstairs in front of the panels afterwards. Then we'll have a discussion with Robert and Michael Popper and Jonathan Rickard of the client from Radian. So get your questions ready. I'd like to thank the Building Centre for hosting this event, NHBC for providing the breakfast that you had, which I hope you had, and of course the competitors for taking part. So without more ado, Sarah, over to you.
Right, thank you very much. My name is Sarah Allan, and I work in the Whitehill Bordon Eco-town team, which is based in East Hampshire District Council, and I lead on eco-housing and retrofitting. And I'm very briefly this morning just going to set the competition in the wider context of the Eco-town and outline our approach and aims for the competition. Also, just to say that the competition was launched in September last year, and it ran until February when we selected the winner. Whitehill Bordon Eco-town is a town of about 16,000 people in Hampshire, not very well connected, I have to say, on public transport, but it's about 40 odd miles from London. And the driver for the Eco-town is really the departure, or the driver for the regeneration of Whitehill Bordon is the departure of the Ministry of Defence, who announced that they are going to leave in 2015, and they'll be leaving behind 250 hectares of land, which will be developable for about 4,000 homes, and also provide some positive opportunities to rebalance the town, give a town that really doesn't have a town centre, a new town centre that you can see in red, a mix of homes, and also employment. About 5,500 jobs are targeted. But also underpinning the town is its ecological role and character, and it's surrounded by, on the south, the South Downs National Park, but also many sites of conservation importance. There are all sorts of wildlife species, amphibians, but very beautiful woodland and countryside. And so the competition, in parallel with work that's been going on to deliver the joint core strategy, the district's vision for the whole area, there's also been the master plan for the town to try and have a whole town approach rather than just looking at piecemeal development. So it was very important in parallel that we try to deliver some small-scale projects, and we had the opportunity with some Eco-town funding from about 2008 or 9 to deliver some small-scale projects. And this is the site for the competition, quite a challenging site. And on this site there are going to be 3 projects. The first, which is a former Ministry of Defence fire station, an Edwardian building, number 1 there, which is on site at the moment, and we're putting in thermal improvements to improve the performance of the building and reducing energy loss. The second project, which is a very exciting one, is an exhibition house designed by Richards Michael, that will be testing different technologies, but also testing different passive design approaches to reducing heat loss, but also benefiting from solar gain. So things like a trombe wall and winter garden, and also in the garden we have an interseasonal heat store. And just to the north of the site, that is the competition site there for 3 eco-terraces. So the main aims of the competition, really, it was a OJU process, and that we've worked in partnership, East Hampshire District Council, with Radian Housing Group, who will be the commissioning client. And what was very important was actually overcoming challenges that are particularly prevalent at the moment, I think, in the public sector, particularly with the lack of money, and that is risk. The risk of running an OJU competition and sort of ticking all the safety boxes. And it was important, and I felt part of my role was to make sure that we secured quality and secured some of our ambitions in the selection of the right team. It wasn't about selecting a particular scheme, but finding the right team to help deliver our ambitions. So we were very ambitious. We wanted to, we were sort of quite inspired by the Wiesenhof-Siedlung in Stuttgart. We wanted to be able to deliver affordable homes, but affordable homes that challenge what affordable housing might be like. We were also inspired by case study houses in California, and wanted to be able to bring some innovation and opportunities to look at mass production, possibly. So not just a solution for the site, but also a model for homes across the town. We're also inspired by the architecture of Vorarlberg, and we wanted to bring sustainable architecture that would create a new identity for the town. So it was very handy that we had an excellent jury with great experts, particularly Richard Partington, who said that's all very well, but we need to think about the realism of being able to deliver these things. And the realism also tempered by the site, which was very challenging, very small, on a busy road here. This is to the north of the site, and that brick building is where the housing will go. So not too inspiring. Also to the west of the site are lots of trees, so providing solar shading, which isn't necessarily what you want. And the site itself was east-west orientated, so again, not providing obvious opportunities for solar benefits. Another constraint or a challenge that we had to overcome was that recent development in the town there hasn't been a lot, but what there has been poor, firmly fitting itself in all the aspects of poor design, which I don't need to go into a lot. But what that did mean was that residents are very suspicious about anything new and about what change might bring. And this poor design has been, it's not just in the last 10 or 15 years, but actually over about 50 years, where piecemeal, inward-looking development has really had a negative impact on the town. So the jury had a very important role, and the opportunity was to work with the district councillors and with residents to really sort of broaden our horizons to what could be provided, as well as bringing the realism. So we had at stage 1 54 submissions and really a lot of very good, exciting teams. The jury worked very hard to shortlist this to 5 teams listed here. And we had a really good variety of designs that you can see in the exhibition space upstairs. But the winning team were led by Ash Sacular Architects, and Richard Partington will go into more detail about some of the lessons from the schemes and why Ash Sacular in the end won. I think it is important to say that what I think they demonstrated was not only listening to residents, really looking at the brief and really understanding it, but also the importance of providing that balance between somewhere that is livable and will be a pleasant home to somewhere that does try to respond to the demands of what sustainable design could be about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. I thought it would be quite helpful, really, to have a kind of canter through all of the submissions, because we were really grateful for the sort of effort that people put in the competition stage and the quality of the schemes that were submitted. So I'm going to talk about the lessons really in a thematic way, but trying to use some of the submitted drawings to illustrate some of the points. But there's two important things about the competition brief that I think are worth mentioning. Firstly, we set very ambitious targets, but we were very mindful of the dilemma of, in a way, prescribing a solution by aiming for a certain energy target. And we really didn't want to have houses whose organisation and use was solely determined by energy requirements. But at the same time, we also wanted to make sure that the sort of claims that were being made about energy and sustainability were actually backed up with some evidence. So instead of just setting targets, we asked the competitors to also do modelling work and to provide some verification of issues to do with CO2 emissions, heat loss, and overheating as well. And we set a minimum target of code level 4 in energy terms, because we also didn't want to rule out other very valid approaches to low energy design, such as passive house, which has a slightly different emphasis. It has an emphasis on demand reduction and on comfort, and is less sort of driven by CO2 emissions reduction. And we wanted to keep that kind of discussion within the kind of competition environment. As Sarah has said, it is a very constrained site, and it makes it very difficult, even just accommodating the accommodation brief within the size of the site. But one of the constraints is there's very little opportunity for private outdoor space, for creating a bit of the outdoor realm, or a transition between the outdoor and the indoor that belongs to the dwelling. And the challenge of the large kind of trees on the western side was also one that provoked different responses. So different competitors had a different attitude to whether that should be appropriated and brought within the schemes, whether it should be modified so that we could improve solar access. And Let's Wheeler had a very kind of, in a way, very simple strategy of making a terrace in a conventional form and trying to suggest some areas to the front and the back of the house that might be for more private use. When I looked at the site, I really struggled to see that you could get 3 houses on it at all. It is very, very constrained. And in a way, that's a good thing for a prototype scheme, because you're setting a difficult task from the outset. And I think Proctor Matthews perhaps stretched the boundaries of the site a little bit, but made a real virtue out of extending the scheme to the north by saying, well, this is also an urban proposal. We need to think about the edges of the site and how we engage with the public realm. So they made a suggestion that actually there was very positive frontage on that busy street, and possibly a new access to the site. Ash Sakula's scheme was very interesting because it actually proposed that you made much more of a kind of usable street on the shared side. It pushed the accommodation to the west towards the landscape. And they were the only ones really to introduce a kind of recognisable sort of indoor-outdoor domain where all of the kind of enjoyable debris of life, bikes, scooters, pot plants, washing, drying, was actually on the street frontage. What was also interesting is that the kind of constrained nature of the site generated two sort of responses in terms of building form. And to my mind, these weren't only kind of architectural responses, they were also partly sort of philosophical ones. So the two schemes that took a passive house approach created very simple terraces. So the houses have a very simple external envelope driven by good kind of practice in building physics, not wanting to have lots of complicated geometries that create heat loss. And the three schemes that followed a more, in a way, code approach, I would say, deliberately took the view that they would present as much roof as possible to south and maximise solar access. And so we had three schemes where houses were effectively turned to present a gable to the street rather than presenting a continuous frontage. And within those, there were different versions of how you would actually then create frontage from effectively the side of a house. And white architecture kind of incorporated one of a kind of European idea of making a courtyard that's also a space that can be used for the car, and in a way proposed a model that was less familiar to the lay members of the jury. This idea that a sort of carport space can also be a useful habitable space. And in doing so, also created some problems for themselves in making a very constrained plot to actually build on. Our secular scheme was also very interesting in that it proposed a very loose form of the house plan. So something that was very open and very flexible. They only proposed two-bedroom houses, which in 95 square metres is quite generous. But it was part of an idea of a kind of loose fit. So instead of prescribing the way that the house is used, there were clues to how it would be interpreted. But it was loose enough and open enough for different kind of interpretations of living to be accommodated. And that was a different approach really from some that were quite prescriptive in the way that they imagined the house would be occupied. I'll come on to some of those a bit later. One of the things we were also looking for, obviously, was the idea of a model that could be replicated in volume or replicated in a way that it could start to make urban space. And it was very interesting to see this drawing from Justin Beer's passive house proposal, which was suggesting that actually the same house in different orientations would perform pretty much similarly in terms of reducing heating load, so all within the passive house standard of 15 kilowatt hours per square metre. And that kind of prompted some interesting discussions and thoughts as well, because actually one associates passive house with a solution that's very orientation driven. So that was quite an interesting approach, but we felt that one of the characteristics of their scheme was that actually it didn't offer enough in terms of external architectural vocabulary to begin to suggest how you start to make streets and spaces. In a way, it was very much driven by some very sound thinking about energy and comfort, and less about some of the kind of wider urban issues. And it's a bit of a kind of it's a conceit that you put a church spire in to make the illustration look kind of very familiar, I'd say. We also were interested in a way. This is the extreme opposite in terms of planning from the winning scheme, in that it is quite a traditionally subdivided space on the ground floor. And we felt that on an east-west orientated site, that was a bit of a missed opportunity, not being able to have a living space that benefited from evening and morning light. And in a way, it's a contrast to the openness of Robert's team's scheme. It also tried to propose 3 bedrooms, but there seemed to be a disproportionate use of accommodation, so a large volume over the stair and a relatively small third bedroom. And it just really it served as a kind of interesting contrast in a way, and one of the two extremes in the proposals. Lots of work can be done on this scheme, however, on costing, which was appreciated. In fact, lots of the discussion in the interview was about how rigorously that team had dealt with that. Proctor Matthews has some very nice ideas about how a courtyard house could be evolved into a kind of urban proposition. So it could be combined in courtyards that also produced productive landscape space, and a house that could turn corners and make very, very kind of enticing external space. They also had some interesting ideas about the internal organisation, but again, this had a mixed reception in the judging process. One of the ideas was that the stair, which is here and turns sort of kind of delightfully around that corner that looks out to the western space, was something that could be used in a variety of ways. So it enclosed the study space, it could be used as a stair wall could be used for library. And it was interesting how a lay audience found it very difficult to understand how you would inhabit a house like that. But they also picked up on some things, quite practical things about whether the courtyard space on our constrained site would actually get enough daylight. So it was an interesting dilemma in this scheme of trying to want to make private enclosed space and make an inventive plan and try and do that on a very, very small site. And of course, with very high energy standards, also with extremely thick external walls. So lots of difficult things being balanced together. We were looking for some innovation, but I think we had, from housing association experience, we'd set some rules in the brief about technologies that we didn't want to see used because we had some very bad experience with them. And so the innovations that we warmed to were ones that really proposed suggestions for ways of living, or prompts for a more sustainable lifestyle, or feedback or measurement that gave the users of the house more information about how they were using it, what the technology was doing, and also ideas that made the technology more manageable and more serviceable. And when we get on to energy, you'll see that all of the proposals suggested a lot of technology was needed to get to the standards we were expecting. In the winning scheme, there were some very clear and nicely illustrated ideas about materials, and a desire to use materials that were inherently benign. So wood fibre insulation, timber products with low emissions. But there are some interesting paradoxes when, for instance, you choose a cedar cladding that's locally sourced, relatively low volume material used sparingly around the outside of the house. But the main volume of material, cross-laminated timber, probably comes from Poland, unless Robert can use his considerable charm and influence to persuade someone to start making it over here. There were innovations in the planning as well, and interestingly, these also were harder for the lay audience to digest. So Let's Reader, we think, designed a very nice house, but it came across as being a very bespoke house. So it would be a wonderful house for a client who had a particular brief. But in suggesting that in all three variations, the living accommodation was on the middle floor, of course, there's quite a few problems, really. I mean, the obvious one is, what happens when your kids are downstairs screaming in the middle of the night and the parents are upstairs 2 floors away. And there are more prosaic issues to do with lifetime homes compliance. You need to have useful reception space on the ground floor, some kind of family gathering space for lifetime homes accreditation. And that's a cutaway section of their scheme. Again, another one that illustrates actually what was going on in terms of technology, and also the very ambitious U values that people were proposing. And that, sorry, a little bit more on innovation, because this one also really stumped us. The idea that you have a rain screen of a material that perhaps has some craft element in it. So here the suggestion that the cladding is a willow or a chestnut hurdle, and that supports kind of biodiversity. It's got wisteria climbing up it, and it's got birds and insects nesting in it. That's either a really beguiling romantic idea, or for a housing manager it's his kind of worst nightmare. And so that kind of split the jury really on and interestingly, a characteristic of Proctor Matthews' submission was that it was just so rich with ideas. There were so many things. It was actually quite difficult to kind of drill down into the really important ones. And we got sidetracked on several proposals on things that perhaps the teams weren't that precious about, but we'd kind of latched onto. And that particularly happened in the energy submission. So White Architecture came with a slightly different approach, saying, What about making an all-electric house? We'll take full advantage of incentives like the feed-in tariff now. We can demonstrate that if you have a large enough south-facing roof, that you can be a net exporter of electricity. So this house will also generate an income for you, as well as being a kind of sustainable place to live. And they did some very interesting analysis. And I think if we could just dwell on this slide a little bit, all of the proposals were aiming at somewhere around passive house in terms of fabric performance. And everybody was getting below the government's fabric efficiency standard, which is proposed for 2016. Nearly everybody was using heat recovery to do that, and very high U values. And the result really is that you get a house where actually the energy demand is pretty much balanced between hot water and heating, which kind of raises a question about future housing, of whether our obsession with heating and reducing heat demand is right. Also whether in a changing climate that's actually going to be the thing that we should be worrying about most, as probably heating demand is going to reduce over time. But this proposal was very much predicated on the idea of using a heat pump, and we'd said we didn't want to see heat pumps. We'd had bad experiences with them. Field trials are showing that it's very variable performance. But White Architect battled on, and unfortunately the heat pump they were proposing was the very one that Radiant Housing Association had been taking out from retrofit projects. So that was a big shotgun aimed at the foot, unfortunately, for this scheme. Beer Architects really clearly demonstrated their experience in using passive house and in realistic energy targets. So interestingly, the practice with the background most in building low energy designs actually was aiming at the most manageable U values, and with a fairly conventional timber frame construction. So an engineered timber stud, insulation on the inside for a service zone to prevent a thermal bridge. And the only one was actually to start modelling thermal bridging, because of course once you insulate these houses really well, most of the heat loss is through other mechanisms. It's through thermal bridging and infiltration losses. It's not through the walls. There's a certain point where pursuing wall U values is actually pretty futile if you haven't thought about the other things as well. Proctor Matthews, again, a beautiful illustration, but the kind of clarity of the drawing belies a certain complexity in the environmental solutions, and this was characteristic of everybody's submission. One of the reasons we set the target at Code 4 is we were sort of hoping somebody would come along and say, well, what about a naturally ventilated house? What about a robust house that we all know works fairly well? We won't pursue endless energy targets, and we'll make it really durable and easy to live in. But I think it's one of the sort of characteristics of competitions. There's a tendency to want to put everything in because you want to show the jurors that you've got it covered. And if you've got some bloke on the panel who's obsessed about solar thermal energy, then you know he's going to tick your box. But my experience trying to do houses like this, where there are up to 3 ways of heating hot water. So you've got a solar thermal panel, you've got something from an efficient condensing boiler, you've got an immersion heater inside. It's very difficult for the house to know how to heat that water. It needs a control system, and it's even harder for the occupier to know how you set that control system to work in an optimal way. And we're certainly finding that housing associations are running a bit scared of solar thermal at the moment because of issues to do with Legionnaires. Obviously you can counter those by pasteurising the whole system, but that bungs loads of energy into the hot water system every fortnight and kind of counters some of the kind of CO2 ambitions. To my mind, PV and solar thermal, they're about equivalent in CO2 terms, so why not just have one simple system? Why not have a system that doesn't introduce complications? And in a way, the final sketch about the winning scheme's submission has a kind of uncertainty to it and a kind of recognition that actually just by designing these things perfectly, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to work like that. In principle, it has all the same elements. So I think, sorry, I'm struggling to find the pointer. I think we ought to look at whether these things can be simplified. But one thing that was very interesting was a proposal to take tempered air via a ground network and feed it into the MVHR unit. So there's a beginning to think about one of the aims of the brief was sort of anticipate issues to do with summer overheating. That will probably have an impact on the efficiency of the fan in the MVHR unit, but it will be very interesting to see whether it makes a useful contribution in the summer condition. It's a difficult thing, again, needs some technical thought because you get condensation in this ground labyrinth, and you've got to know how you're dealing with the quality of the fresh air coming into the house. We've also had, rats and rabbits loving this kind of underground environment when we've tried it. But I'll leave this slide up for a little bit because it is fascinating that the standardization in the way that these things are approached. Nobody proposed a cavity wall. Everybody proposed some form of prefabrication. Everybody proposed a mechanical ventilation system with heat recovery. Everybody proposed that we used, apart from the passive house schemes that said actually we can get to passive house without any of these renewables, and if you really want to bung them on to meet UK policy, then we can do that on an east-west roof. And in a way we really warmed to this project most, going back to the kind of sustaining a vision about how it would be used. Every technology idea was kind of backed up with some thoughts about what it meant for the way that the house was used and what it meant for people trying to understand how it's going to be operated and what it meant for a housing association trying to run it. And I think there was an acknowledgement that these things are complicated. The next stage is trying to get a way of understanding how they're running and getting some engagement between the occupiers and the technology. It's one of the paradoxes of the kind of whole code process in the last few years is that the most sophisticated houses have been forced upon what you could say is the least enthusiastic audience for them. So we're getting very complicated houses being used in affordable housing. One well-known housing association director has a phrase, we're building Code 6 houses for Code 1 occupiers. And it's that sort of mismatch. I know this seems to be slightly disparaging to me, but the point is that actually people who are used to using something very intuitively without any instruction at all expect the house to work on its own. And so the final scheme, again, a lovely drawing, recognising that you do hang clothes up to dry, you need a good space to hang them, you do put stuff outside in front, that actually the house is a thing that is appropriated and occupied. It's not a mechanism that is enforced on people. So, fair summary, Robin, I must have left things out.
Brilliant, thank you very much.